that I think we think of when we think about prevention is bystander intervention, and it's something that's gotten a lot of traction in the past few decades. Um, I will say this is a very interactive format for this workshop, and it probably won't work very well if we don't have participation. I understand that some of you may be doing other tasks and things, but as you're able, I would love for you to jump in just with any questions or comments. Really with this, I guess I want to start off by asking, who's been in a bystander intervention training before, just by a show of hands or in the chat, however works best. I'd love to see who's been in a bystander intervention training or done a bystander intervention training before. So I know a lot of organizations are starting to require it for employees and staff. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands. That's great actually to know. So this is going to be hopefully some new information. One thing that I often notice with bystander intervention is it tends to get really abstract really quickly, and it can turn into, here are the things that you should do, and you should always intervene no matter what, and with no regard to, context or safety or social comfortability. So all of those things are things I want to touch on today. I want us to really be thinking about these concepts in a real world context. And if there are concerns or context dependent nuances, I really want to get into those. I don't want to just gloss over them. So as those come up, please do put them in the chat or interrupt me. With this virtual format, I do not mind being interrupted. So please feel free to unmute and just talk over me at any point, and I will hopefully answer any questions that come up. So our very first thing before we get started, I just sent a form in the chat. This is something that we actually do need for our grant reporting. And so I would like everyone to fill out the first page of this. So the way that it's set up, there should be 2 pages, and they're basically identical, but the first one is our pretest, and the second page we'll have you do at the end. So what I'll have you do is open the form, just fill out the first page and maybe hit next. And then don't fill out the second page just yet. I'll let you know when to do that at the end. But I really do appreciate you doing that. That is really helpful for, oh no.
Yeah, I just clicked on that as
information.
well. I was going to bring that up to your attention that it says you
Yeah.
need access, and then
Okay, let me fix that right now.
okay,
Thank you
perfect.
for bringing that to my attention. So I'm going to say anyone with the link can respond. Okay, if you go ahead and try to reload it, does that work now?
Yeah, we're good to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks for bearing with me on that. Okay, so with that being said, I know some of us may have been in the last training or last few trainings from our center, but I do want to just kind of give an overview of what we do here at the Rape Recovery Center. So we serve Salt Lake and Tooele counties. We are the designated rape crisis center for both Salt Lake and Tooele counties. There's a rape crisis center serving every community in the state, and we are covering Salt Lake and Tooele, so we're the largest and the only standalone rape crisis center. So I have, if you have any questions about that, I can definitely address those now or at the end. But super quickly, right, our mission is just to support and empower survivors of sexual violence. And part of that is what we're doing right now, educating about the cause, impact, and prevention about sexual violence. In keeping with our mission of supporting and empowering survivors, I want to go over our services super quickly. Just as a refresher, in case anyone needs it. So we provide all of our services for free, and we, like I said, serve Salt Lake and Tooele counties, but we are able to offer virtual appointments as well as in-person. So we have an in-person office in Sugar House here in Salt Lake City, which was where I am based out of. We also have a satellite office in Tooele City, serving those communities. So just so you know, you can always schedule a virtual appointment or an in-person appointment. Okay, so our services range from advocacy, which is essentially just case management, really helping survivors know what options are available to them, helping them feel safe after an assault, whether that's, making sure they're not in contact with someone who might have harmed them, using the legal or criminal legal avenues to ensure that. So again, navigating law enforcement, the court system, if survivors choose to do so, but also things like employment and housing assistance if survivors need that. let's see, we have a mobile response team, so that's 24/7, a team that's always on call and can accompany a survivor to any hospital across Salt Lake or Tooele counties to assist with the forensic examination, the Code R exam. So if you're not aware about that, I can talk more about that at the end. But any survivor up to 6 days after a sexual assault can actually go to any hospital and get a free forensic exam, which is essentially a certified nurse examiner takes DNA evidence, just documenting the injuries. A lot of the time, they'll take the clothes that the survivor was wearing just to analyze it for DNA. And this can be kind of it can be a helpful resource, especially if clients are interested in pursuing a court case, if they want to open an investigation. But it can also be very traumatizing. So we have uh, advocates who are on call 24/7 will help with that at any time of the day, any part of the valley, any hospital. Just providing extra change of clothes, food, emotional support, advocacy, all of that good stuff. And then lastly, of course, we have our free therapy. We have a few full-time therapists on staff who are all trained in trauma-informed modalities. And we prioritize folks without insurance or on Medicaid. And so we'll make referrals to folks who have private insurance. But we always work directly with survivors to make sure that whatever option we're giving is the best one for them. So are there any questions about our direct services, so advocacy, case management, mobile response therapy?
Doesn't look like there's any in the chat. I do appreciate the refresher as we've been doing these presentations. It's been really nice.
Good, excellent. Yeah, thank you. And if anything does come up, please let me know.
Perfect.
Okay, so moving into our topic for today. So again, bystander intervention is one piece of the prevention puzzle. We sometimes like to divide our prevention work into a few different categories. So a lot of what I do is primary prevention, really trying to change cultures of sexual violence, reinforce cultures of consent, make sure people know what consent is, what boundaries are, how to have healthy relationships, all of that. But there's this other piece which we call secondary prevention, and that's where bystander intervention kind of falls. And this encompasses sort of everything that you do to intervene while a harmful situation is happening, or maybe right before a harmful situation is about to happen. And so this is much more in the moment, rather than targeting the root cause, really trying to target individual instances of harm. And of course, this applies to sexual assault in a lot of cases. And when I talk to college students, we often talk about scenarios at like parties, house parties, or if you are noticing unhealthy behaviors between friends and their relationships. This is really something that shows up in all aspects of life. So we'll go through some scenarios at the end that will hopefully illuminate that a little bit more. So our agenda today is threefold. We want to start off with how do we even recognize when something bad is happening or something potentially harmful? And oftentimes that's the hardest part. And as a part of that, we will talk about the bystander effect, which is one of the reasons why we often don't intervene. Maybe you've heard of this before, but we'll get kind of delve into the specifics. And then lastly, of course, we'll talk about how do you intervene? What are some different techniques and strategies? Knowing that the same strategy is not going to work in every context and for every person or personality type or whatever it is. So I want to really give you a couple options so you can come away from this feeling like you have multiple avenues towards intervening. Okay, so very first question, I sort of hinted at this before, but I'd love to just get kind of a few people to maybe unmute or put in the chat. What do you know about bystander intervention already? Have you heard about it? What are some preconceptions or prior experiences you've had with bystander intervention?
I do know, in speaking to your question that you had earlier today about who's done bystander intervention, is regarding sexual assault or rape recovery. I don't know if our organization has touched on much of bystander intervention that I know of, at least during my time here.
Yeah,
So it
that's
may be
excellent.
minimal
Yeah,
from what our
that's
group
great.
may know.
Yeah, no, I really just kind of want to get a baseline so I know how much. Like, I often go to the college campuses, and most of them are required to do a bystander
Yeah.
intervention training. And so then all the kids there are like, oh, I've already done this. It's so boring. So, Just kind of
Yeah,
want to get a baseline.
and we have a ton of different organizations too, right? So we have folks on here
Yeah.
that are coming at it from an approach of like youth services and working directly with youth, or aging and adult services.
Hmm.
It looks like in the chat just a small amount based on sexual harassment.
Right.
So
Yeah. I think that's pretty common. Like
yeah.
having this is part of a larger sexual assault or sexual harassment training.
Mhm.
Very nice. Okay. So that's really helpful. If anything else, oh, I see another one.
Yep.
Good, thank you.
And
Intervention can be difficult because it can feel like judging someone else's relationship or situation. Exactly. And we're going to get into that. It's one of the biggest barriers that there is, I think, to intervening, especially in contexts where there's strangers involved or where we aren't as acquainted with the people involved. So we'll definitely get into that. Thank you, Laura. Anyone else before we jump in? Perfect. If anything else does come up, please let me know. Okay, so Um, there are definitely challenges that come with uh, intervening in a bystander scenario. Essentially, bystander intervention, right? It's kind of what it sounds like. We don't want to be a bystander, or rather, we want to be an active bystander in situations where there is active or potential harm. Um, and oftentimes, there are barriers at each of these steps, right? So, noticing the incident and interpreting it as harmful, assuming responsibility, and I think this is kind of what you're referring to, Laura, right? A lot of the time we don't feel like we are in a place to intervene, or we don't want to judge someone else's situation or make an assumption about how something is going. And so we're going to talk about different ways that we can assume responsibility that actually can maybe mitigate that a little bit. And then, of course, knowing how to help is the prerequisite to taking action. And so we'll talk about those strategies at the end. So really to jump in, I want to talk about those first two steps, right? Noticing the incident and interpreting it as harmful. I think this is probably maybe one of the easiest for a lot of us. I think especially with the work that you all do, I know we're probably pretty sensitive to interpreting harm. But particularly in a context of sexual or gender-based harm, I want to get some input from you all. What are kind of some red flags or cues that you look for when you're in an environment and hopefully looking to notice or interpret a situation as harmful? How do you recognize a situation as harmful?
I think for me, immediately my mind goes to body language, right? I feel like body language is really telltale. A couple of other comments came in as controlling behaviors or yelling and or raised voices.
Excellent. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Good. Oh, aggression, body language, violence. Yes. So body language is a huge one, and we'll talk about that. Physical violence, I think it kind of goes along with this yelling and aggression, right? So if there is this very visible escalation, that's maybe a situation where something should be done, even if it's not direct intervention. Good. Just simply noticing whether or not the person looks like they're comfortable with someone. Absolutely. And then those controlling behaviors. And as I'm sure we're all aware, those can show up in a lot of different ways, in very subtle ways or in maybe not so subtle ways. Really good. If other things come up, please let me know. But we kind of touched on some of these, right? So someone appearing uncomfortable with how someone is touching or talking to them, really noticing that body language. If someone is maybe tense, if someone is turning their body away, if there is tension in their voice, etc. Something that we often touch on, especially with our college students, is if there's a repeated offering or use or involvement of substances, especially alcohol or illicit drugs. And a lot of the times, we see this among young adults, but also among older adults, right? In situations where alcohol is involved, sometimes this pattern of one individual offering the other one, repeatedly offering them alcohol or trying to get them intoxicated to lower their resistance. And then someone persisting after being rejected by someone multiple times. So, kind of, I'm kind of seeing this in the aggression piece and partly in body language that I saw in the chat. But if someone is clearly not interested and you can sort of tell they're not interested, but another individual is continually pressuring them or or keeps asking or pestering. And then the other thing I really want to highlight and draw attention to is this idea of power and control. And so I really want to, bring this out into the open. Sometimes these power dynamics that we encounter, in everyday life, can get in the way or complicate our ability to recognize harm and situations that might not be consensual. Right. So maybe in a workplace situation, if someone is hierarchically in a higher position over someone else, it can be hard to recognize or interpret events as harmful or controlling because, well, naturally, that person has power and control over this other individual. So where exactly is the line, right? And so again, we'll get into situations like that where it maybe is a little more complicated. The other thing with this is, we have, especially when it comes to romantic and sexual contexts, and maybe you're seeing this with your teens, maybe you're seeing this in your own life, among family members, whatever it is, right? We have kind of these social scripts for how romantic and sexual encounters are supposed to go, right? Where there are especially gender roles involved. One person is supposed to be active and pursuing someone else, and the other person is supposed to be pursued. Oftentimes that maps onto, masculine gender roles and feminine gender roles, respectively. And also this kind of idea of how people are supposed to respond to sexual advances based on their gender, based on their age, based on their social positioning, based on the level of acquaintance they have with someone, based on a lot of different factors, right? So I want to just name that, and we'll kind of get into, again, some specifics of what that looks like. Any questions about this? This is really just to kind of um, get us started. Okay, perfect. So I want to talk about the bystander effect, which is, like I mentioned, the biggest barrier to people intervening. Has anyone heard of the bystander effect before or have an idea of what it is? We're able to infer from title. Seeing a yes in the chat. Very good. Would anyone like to offer potential
Um,
definition?
uh, this is Melanie with the DA's office.
Wonderful.
I believe, but I could be wrong, that it's if somebody else, a third party, kind of stands up for someone, it can change the dynamic, and um, maybe make them safer, and because they're being noticed and the conduct is being made aware that it's inappropriate.
Sure. Yeah, I actually really love that. That's pretty close. So I would actually say what you just said is maybe the flip side of this coin of the bystander effect, right? So a lot of the time when we're talking about the bystander effect, we're talking about reasons people do not intervene. And so, as we're kind of moving through the bystander effect and into strategies, we'll kind of talk about actually when someone does intervene, it does make others more likely to help. And so you're exactly right with that. So the bystander effect has a few different components, right? It's kind of at its base the tendency for people not to intervene in a situation where there are others around who are also not doing anything, right? Or the tendency, if we see a situation of harm, to be a passive bystander, right? To not take responsibility or assume that we have a role in stopping that harm. And so there are a few different reasons that shows up, right? One of the most common ones that comes up is this diffusion of responsibility. So, especially if we're in a public space or in a place with a lot of other folks with authority or folks who maybe we think are better equipped to deal with the situation, or simply if we're just like, well, there are so many other people here, someone else can deal with it, right? And again, like this can be amplified by a lot of different factors. So I think some of those that come up are this idea of social evaluation, right? Maybe, and maybe this one seems like it's not as big of a deal, but I think it's a lot stronger in actual contexts, in real life situations, where maybe we're in public and there is someone causing a scene and we are afraid if we intervene, it's going to reflect badly on us. We're going to be embarrassed. We're going to suffer in some way, or we'll be judged for intervening or for trying to help. Maybe if the intervention goes south and it doesn't exactly go as we planned it, maybe it will result in negative social consequences for us. And I just really want to validate that. Like, I think that is a really strong motivating factor for folks not to intervene. And I want us to kind of feel confident that there are ways to get around that. So again, we'll talk about that. I keep saying this, we'll talk about that later, but I promise we will get to it. Um, Another really common factor is maybe we're just unfamiliar with the situation, right? Maybe this is our first time in that context, or we're not sure how to intervene in that specific situation. Maybe we don't know who to go to get help. Maybe we are not as acquainted with the layout of the physical space we're in, and so we don't feel as comfortable or like our intervention would be supportive. So that's a really common one as well. Um, Back to, I think, what Laura said at the beginning, right? Maybe we feel like we don't know enough about the relationship that we're observing, right? Maybe we see people uh, in what appears to be kind of a fight or bickering, or maybe there's some physical touch going on that we aren't comfortable with. But maybe in that relationship, we're like, maybe that's just how they interact, right? Maybe that is normal in their relationship, and I don't want to, pass judgment on that relationship just because I have different, views of how folks should interact or how I would want to interact in a situation like that.
Sam,
And so that could be really, yes.
I also think that's a really interesting point. I don't know if I've ever thought about it before, but like our
Yeah.
own bias when it comes to relationships, right?
Yeah.
Like viewing it through the lens of like how I would want to be treated versus like what I allow in my own
Hmm.
relationships and vice versa. And that can also play into effect of like, oh, like that's normal for what I
Yeah.
perceive as normal versus what I
Yeah.
perceive as not normal. I think that is really
Exactly.
interesting to take into consideration.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And like, it goes both ways, right? Because we can have these biases that are like, oh, this couple that I'm observing, they're bickering, and like, I don't know if I would want that in my relationship. But maybe that's just how they are, so I'm not going to intervene. But it can also go the other way, right? Where maybe we don't notice instances of harm because they're normalized for us, but maybe not for
Right,
others.
right.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting. I think this comes up a lot, among people that maybe we are comfortable with or do know. So if we see, like our friend, like my best friend, having a conversation with, their spouse, and they're making kind of these maybe jokes, right? That um, I would consider maybe to be harsher than than I would want in my relationship. But maybe that's just the way that they joke in their relationship, and maybe I'm not. I don't know that, right? So um, usually what we say is, if you have kind of this gut feeling that something seems off, right, or something is maybe not how you would want in your relationship, but you're afraid of like infringing on someone else's relationship style or whatever it is. We usually advise starting with one of the more or one of the less direct methods of intervention, which we'll get into. um, Very nice. uh, let's see. Next, we have this perceived cost to self, which comes along with the diffusion of responsibility, right? We think that other people are able to take care of the situation or are better equipped to take care of the situation, or maybe, other people are actually in a better position to take care of the position, right? Or the situation, because maybe they have more time, right? Maybe you're on your way to an important meeting. Maybe you are really concerned about getting hurt yourself, right? Or maybe this is a situation where you're close to both people and you don't want to take sides, right? You don't want to ruin a relationship with one or both of those people by intervening. And so there are, we're always taking into consideration, right, these different factors in our minds. How is this going to affect my relationship with this person? How is this going to affect my day or my life going forward or my involvement in the situation, right? Am I going to just like get embroiled in this and then get sucked in and never not be able to get out, right? So all of these things, again, I just want to validate those and say, there are ways to intervene or ways to provide support that don't necessarily have us, getting sucked in or involve risk to ourselves. Um, Maybe sometimes there will be minimal risk, right? But I also want to emphasize that our physical safety is going to be really important throughout all of these strategies. And then lastly, there's this kind of complicated psychological concept called pluralistic ignorance, which I always have kind of a hard time just describing or explaining. But the idea that especially again, if you're in a public space or a space with multiple people, if no one else is doing anything, you're more likely to assume that nothing is actually wrong and that you're just kind of overthinking it or making it into a bigger deal than it is. Because, as your thought process goes, there's all these other people around them and no one else is doing anything about it. So I must just be overreacting, or everyone else has sort of appraised the situation, evaluated it as not harmful. And so maybe I'm just being hypersensitive. I should just, go along with what everyone else is doing. So again, very closely related to the diffusion of responsibility, but a more specific concept of really trying to infer from what everyone else is doing, what the severity of the situation is. And I bring this up because this is something that I think is pretty reasonable in a lot of situations, something that we do unconsciously, but something that can impede our confidence in intervening. And so something I think that we should be aware of, right? A lot of the time in a situation of harm, or where something is going on that where I'm trying to decide if I should intervene or not, I think about this concept explicitly, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like no one else is doing anything, but am I also just like giving into this bias of pluralistic ignorance, right? Thinking that nothing's wrong. In the chat, I think it's also super interesting in the assumption that someone else will take care of the situation and then letting it be and not stepping in. Yeah, exactly. And like, this doesn't always come from a bad place, right? A lot of the time in bystander intervention trainings, people will be like, well, if you don't step in, then you're being just as bad as everyone else, and right. But I really think it's like it's the combined, it's the collective aspect um, of social situations, right, where we're like, well, there's all these other people. Maybe I'm not the most qualified, right? And so, Trudy, it's like you're saying, and Melanie, like you were saying earlier, with the flip side of the bystander effect. If one person intervenes, then all of a sudden that kind of breaks the ice, right? A lot of it's much more likely that other people are going to intervene. And this has been observed in studies. There's a video that sometimes I show where they have kind of actors, right, playing people in distress, and if one person steps in, one actor steps in, then all of a sudden all these other people, all these bystanders are like, oh, this is actually a situation that I can help out with, and start to offer their support as well, right? So the hardest part often really is just getting that first person in there. And so what I really want to encourage us all to do is to identify ourselves as maybe that one person, and to know that if we do step in, the likelihood that others are going to help and support um, increases greatly. Okay, good. So that is the bystander effect, and I've been saying we'll talk about strategies. We'll talk about strategies. So I really just want to get to that and have that be the bulk of our presentation. And we're doing really well with timing, so we're about halfway through, and this leaves us with a good amount of time to get through this. So here is kind of my model that I like to use. I think this is really helpful. And this is actually something I have saved in my phone. So I just have a note on my notes app that has these 5 Ds, because even though that's like, this mnemonic device with everything starting with D, it's hard to remember them all the time, especially in a moment of crisis. So I have a note on my phone that has the 5 Ds of intervention, as well as the sexual assault statewide helpline, the suicide prevention helpline, the mental health warm line at HMHI, right? 988, right? Just kind of a bunch of resources that might be helpful in a crisis situation, or in a situation where someone just needs more long-term support, right? So I definitely recommend doing something like that, where you have, strategies for stepping in a situation, along with the resources that maybe can help with that. And along with, uh, a lot of the time, this hesitancy to step in, this uncertainty about what to do, can actually be helped a lot by having those resources on hand. And maybe in the moment, if you have time, or if you are in a position to do so, maybe calling one of the hotlines and saying, hey, I'm in a situation where I think there might be harm going on. Do you have any recommendations, right? So that's something I like to point out as well, especially with the services that we offer, and with domestic violence and sexual assault. A lot of those hotline services are available to bystanders and secondary survivors as well. So if you are in a situation and you want to support someone else, you're able to get that support from these on-call advocates. I'm seeing in the chat from Lynn, these are the same 5 Ds from our sexual harassment prevention training. Oh, that's so good to hear. Yeah, and like when I first received these in a training, I think when I was in college, right, when we were required to do our bystander intervention training, I was like, okay, that's just like, some social scientist just came up with these as like a way to, um, make the training sound really official and formal. But as I've kind of gone through and really tried to apply these in situations in my professional life, but also my personal life, um, I find them really helpful, right? In giving me multiple options. So one of the ways that I think, or one of the kind of tendencies I think we all have in bystander intervention is to think the only way to intervene is through direct intervention, right? And as you can see, that's one of our 5Ds, but there are 4 other options as well. And so each of these is going to have like a degree of directness and a degree of indirectness, with maybe distraction being uh, more on the direct side, documenting and delaying being more on the indirect side. But let's just talk about each of these in order. And I would again welcome any questions or comments with each of these things. So we'll start with distract. This is one that I think is a pretty beginner friendly. Like it's often taught along with direct intervention in a lot of bystander intervention trainings. And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? So disrupting the harassment or the harm that's being caused by directly interrupting the actions. And so we'll contrast this with our direct approach later, right? Which is maybe more like, hey, is everything okay here? Stepping in and saying, like, can I help with something, or are you okay, right? Distraction is more like, you're getting involved directly, but you're not addressing the harm directly, right? So you're talking to the folks involved, but maybe you're saying you're trying to kind of introduce factors that are unrelated to the conflict, right? So I don't know, maybe I am in, I don't know, the copy room, right? At my workplace, and I'm kind of noticing an escalating situation. If I'm able to maybe just like cause a little bit of a scene, sometimes that can break up some of the tension. It can uh, I don't know, a lot of the time, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, right? When we're in conflict, we kind of get tunnel vision. It can be hard to notice the environment around us, see other things that are happening around us. And so if we're able to bring folks' attention back to their environment, that's often a really good first step in de-escalating a situation. So, knocking something over in between, just getting in the way, right? Or tripping and causing someone's attention, right, in a conflict to have to be directed to something else, right? And that can often be a way to allow maybe a person who's being harmed to get out of the way, to get other support, get other help, but also really just to diffuse any conflict that's happening, even to a small extent, right? Um, some tips with this one, trying only to talk to the person being harmed where possible. So again, if you're able to kind of discern in a situation, there's one person who's kind of the aggressor and one person who is more on the defensive side. Try to talk to the person first who is more on the defensive side, because they are less likely to take out their aggression on you. Again, so assessing the safety of the situation is really important. Um, and then again, like, don't refer specifically to the harassment. Talk about something completely unrelated, right? Maybe if it's a work thing and you're stumbling across someone, you're like, oh, hey, I've been meaning to talk to you about this, uh, this deliverable that we talked about, right? Or something that is again completely unrelated. Um, so it could be as simple as, at a party, hey, will you come help me grab some more ice or some more chips from the kitchen, right? Um, and then we'll talk about some ways that we can combine these in a minute as well. Um, another example, excuse me, do you know where the bathroom is? Or, hey, are you able to help me with directions, right? Or help me find something I'm looking for. Help me find some rubber bands or something, right? Okay, so we'll look at all of these in application to direct scenarios in just a minute, but I want to go through the other 4Ds first. So our second D is going to be delegate, and I think this one really speaks to me as someone who's very shy, doesn't really like intervening directly, doesn't really like getting involved in other people's business, right? And often likes someone else with more authority to be in charge or take control. So if that sounds like you, delegating is a great option. Getting someone else involved, right? So situations where this might not work, right, are situations where maybe you're the only person there, the only third party there. But even in those situations, right, like I mentioned, maybe calling a friend or calling a hotline and saying, hey, there's a situation, I don't exactly know how to intervene. What do you think, right? Just getting an external perspective. And so I find this really helpful, especially when I'm coping with the bystander effect or pluralistic ignorance. And I'm having all these thoughts like, well, I want to intervene, but I don't know enough about the situation, or I don't know how to intervene. Um, just getting another perspective can be really helpful. And I think that falls under delegate. Okay. So again, obviously in medical or mental health emergencies, dialing 911 is a good option. But also making sure you're checking in with the person who's being harmed if possible, right? A lot of the times, especially in domestic violence situations, people actually don't want the police called. That can actually be more harmful to the survivor than helpful. And so, a lot of the time we want to ensure that we're getting consent from the harmed party before getting law enforcement involved. But again, if there's a medical or mental health emergency, someone's in immediate physical danger, 911 is generally what we advise. And then if we don't have a lot of authority, right? If this is maybe a formal event, like a work event, or even in a situation where you're in a public space or like a grocery store or a bar, right? There's going to be someone there who has more authority than you, whether that's the store manager, the bartender, the bouncer, right? And so oftentimes that can be a helpful way of saying, okay, I want to do something, but I don't really have, it's not really my place to, right? That can be an option there. The last thing with this one is delegating very specifically is one of the skills that we like to teach. So instead of saying, hey, someone please call 911 or someone help, right? If you're in a situation with strangers, saying you and pointing at someone, can you help with this, right? Or if you know some of the folks involved, saying, calling them up by name and saying, Brendan, will you call 911, right? Or Brittany, will you call 911? Okay. Again, super nuanced. So we'll look at this in the context of some scenarios and what delegation looks like in different contexts. But our next D is going to be delay, and this is something that we can use again if maybe we're more on the shy side or don't want to intervene, or maybe it's not safe to intervene. This one can be tricky though because we want to make sure that harm isn't about to be caused and that we'll be intervening after harm has already been caused, right? So if we're kind of able to assess that. That maybe there's not really an opportunity for us to cause a distraction to get someone else involved. Maybe it's in the middle of a really important formal event that we can't disrupt, or maybe we can use this tactic, right? Delaying. And so delay doesn't mean delaying the harm per se, but rather delaying your intervention. So really checking the individual or party after the event has happened. And again, if this is a situation where there's immediate danger, like looks like someone's getting another person really drunk, right? You probably want to intervene right away. But if there was like an offhand comment and you didn't know how to respond in the moment, maybe delaying could be a good option. I mentioned some of these can be combined with other strategies. So if we go back to our distract, one of my favorite ones, I had to actually use this at a house party when I was in college. I noticed that one of my friends was getting touched in a really invasive way, and I was like, oh, that doesn't look like maybe they want to, but I'm not entirely sure, right? So what I said was, to the friend who was being harmed, right? Hey, will you help me grab some more snacks from the kitchen, super quick? And then we went to the kitchen together, and then I was able to say, hey, I noticed this person is touching you. They're giving you a shoulder rub. Is that like something you're comfortable with? I didn't want to speak up right away in case it was, but I just wanted to check in, right? And that is one way to combine those two strategies. Check in with the person, and really kind of a lot of the time diffusing that fear of, I'm going back in the chat trying to find who said it. I think it was Laura. I think there was another, and Brittany also mentioned this a little bit, right? But diffusing this fear of intervening and it being really awkward, or it being the wrong move, or it being actually completely okay and you were just overestimating or over interpreting the situation. Okay. So with delay, I think this one, we'll talk about some other, at the very end, I'll talk about how to support friends who have gone through sexual harassment, sexual assault specifically, right? But one of the most important things is, giving people options, telling them that you saw what was happening and you know it's not okay, or that you are wondering if it was okay or not, but really not trying to take control of the situation, right? Really letting that person stay in control and decide what the best way for you to help them is, or the best way for them to help themselves is. Okay. So just some examples of how to say that, how to word that. Are you okay? Do you need anything? even as simple as, hey, I'm just checking in. Is everything okay? Are you all right? Right? Um, or just staying with someone, right? Can I sit here with you? Or do you want to walk and talk, right? So again, a lot of this will depend on context, which we'll get into. Just 2 more Ds left, and then we'll talk about those. There's this piece on documentation, which we'll get to, and I'll come back to you that as well. So I think delaying is one of the most common strategies to be combined with others. And so, like I said, we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so direct intervention is what we most think about when we're talking about bystander intervention, right? If someone's like laying on the street, like in the Good Samaritan parable, right? Or if someone is like very clearly escalating a fight, right? A lot of the time we think of intervention as getting in there, breaking up the fight, saying, hey, stop, this is not okay, right? Or checking in with the person on the street saying, hey, like, do you need anything? Okay? The thing with this one, though, actually, is that it might be the least common way of intervening in a situation because a lot of the time there are all of these concerns, right? Are you physically safe? Is the person being harmed physically safe? Will direct intervention actually make the situation worse? In a lot of cases, it actually will, right? Or does the person being harmed seem like they want someone else to speak up? Or would it maybe embarrass them too much if we intervened or cause them to I don't know, maybe put them in further danger later on, right? If we were to cause a public scene. Okay, so these are kind of the questions I really want us to ask before we do direct intervention. Okay, and the other tip with direct intervention is to try to avoid escalation, right? And to try to avoid us getting sucked into the conflict is to have kind of a few phrases that we really want to stick to, right? A lot of the time, and I'm sure a lot of us are aware of this with conflict resolution, but the other person in that situation, especially if they're really worked up, is maybe going to try to provoke you, right? Is maybe going to try to, um, uh, argue you into corner and, you know, what's the word? Deflect a lot of the methods that you're using, right? So try to keep it succinct, right? Try to keep the things you're saying to maybe 2 or 3 phrases, and don't get sucked into a rabbit hole of a completely different argument or take things personally. Okay, uh, so just some examples of this, right? I really like this one. It says we don't make these kinds of jokes here, right? I think that's helpful in like a friend group, right? Where maybe someone makes a joke that reinforces rape culture, right? Or reinforces harmful attitudes about maybe that are misogynistic or homophobic. Okay, but also as direct as saying, well, that's not okay. That this needs to stop here, right? And then this also, I think things like just asking, hey, are you okay? Can I get some help? What do you need? Count as direct intervention as well, and are maybe a more softer approach to direct intervention. And then finally, just to get through our last piece, document, which just means, and it can take a lot of different forms, right? But taking note of what's happening and making that available to a harmed party or parties at a later point. So, like I said, this goes along really heavily with delay. So a lot of the times we'll document and then, at a later point approach someone who's being harmed and say, hey, I have this video or I have this audio recording or I just like took these notes and just wanted to check in, right? So like I said, this can take a lot of different forms. It can be just opening the notes app and saying, opening a note and saying it's March 11th, it's 12:46. This is happening, at the corner of State Street and 7th West, or State Street and 7th South. State Street and West doesn't make sense. Or if you feel comfortable, if there are enough other people around taking a video, right? And then, of course, always asking the harmed person for their consent afterward and saying, hey, do you want to use this documentation? If not, I'm going to delete it, right? So consent is a super important part of this, okay? Some other pieces with documentation, if you're taking a video, it can be helpful to say on the video, so you start recording, and you say out loud, today is Tuesday, March 11th, it's 12:46, here's where I am, here's what's happening, okay? That can be helpful just to provide additional context and maybe make a stronger case, right? So a lot of the times this comes along with situations where it's too dangerous to intervene directly. And so we want to make sure that we're assessing our safety in these situations as well before resorting to this rather than something like delegating, calling someone with more authority or delaying. Okay, any questions about the 5Ds before we dive into some scenarios? And this is really the most, I was kind of rushing through that piece because I really want to get to the scenarios. But any questions about those, the abstract piece, conceptual piece? Great. So we talked about I gave kind of some examples. I really just want to flesh out some of these scenarios in a more specific way. So we won't spend 5 minutes on each of these. We'll just kind of do this together as a group. Usually when I'm in person, we split up into, breakout groups. But what I want you to do is think about go through each of these ways, right? Distract, delegate, delay, direct, and document. What are the 5Ds? And how would you use each of those in these situations? And like, even if some of them seem like it wouldn't be the best intervention option, I want us to name it anyway, okay? So there's this first one. One day at the grocery store, you notice a couple that you don't know, so they're strangers, arguing loudly in the aisle nearby. They are yelling at each other and both seem very upset. You're worried it's about to get physical, but you don't want to cause a scene or get involved in this random fight. So I want to ask, first of all, what are some of the thoughts that might come up for you if you encountered a situation like this? So just starting really broad.
Are you asking just like general like reactions about the situation?
Yeah, if you're in this situation, what do you think would... Very good. So I'm receiving David, drop a bottle of spaghetti sauce on the floor, right? Yeah, Sana said it would make me nervous for sure. Laura said that I would be perceived as meddling. Exactly, good. So you can tell maybe that they're a couple, right? And you don't know them, so you're just kind of some random stranger. Good. I'm seeing another response. Use distract and ask to where to find a grocery item. Really good. Go to the customer service to find an agent to intervene. Really nice. So we're seeing a lot of these play out, right? Distraction by asking them where to find an item, right? Dropping a jar of spaghetti sauce on the floor. Delegating by getting someone else involved, right? Especially someone with more authority. Or maybe if you're able to kind of use distract and delay, maybe you're with a friend or a partner and you're like, hey, you go ask where the bathroom is, and I'm going to talk to the person who's getting yelled at, right? And maybe that could be a method to delay. And then direct. I think this is probably, again, most scary of the situation, right? And I really want to go back to what Sana said. I promise that response wasn't planted. We didn't plan this. But I actually had a situation like this at the grocery store a few weeks ago, which is why I wrote it this way. And it wasn't two people in the store. It was one person getting really worked up on the phone with someone that it sounded like was their partner. And then they started kind of hitting things on the shelves and, just getting really upset. And so my thoughts were, this person seems like they might hurt me if I try to intervene, right? Maybe there's substance use involved, right? Maybe there is a mental health condition involved that I'm not qualified to address, right? This is something we don't talk about a lot in bystander intervention, but we encounter it all the time, right? If you're ever walking in an area where maybe you come across someone who is dealing with mental health issues or substance use issues or is in an unstable position, right? A lot of the time we resort to, oh, that's not my problem because, it's too dangerous, right? Or they're going to harass me, or I'm in danger, right? So maybe the direct intervention isn't the best in this situation. So this is what I want us to remember, that we actually have these other options, right? Okay, very good. So just for the sake of time, let's go on to this next scenario. We're at brunch. I hope you like my beautiful picturesque brunch graphic here, with a group of friends, including close friends, but also some people you don't know very well. Okay. So one of the people that you don't know as well, maybe a friend of a friend, makes a homophobic joke just offhand and doesn't say and no one says anything about it. Okay. What are some strategies that you might use, going back to our 5Ds, in this situation? Very nice, Laura. Good. So this is actually one of the best pieces of advice that we like to give, right? With jokes or with offhand comments, a lot of the time, just like making a comment or finding a way to subtly let them know that like it didn't really land, right? Whether that's like, I don't know what you mean by that, or like like, what did you say? Could you repeat that? Right. And this is maybe a little bit more of a gentle way to signal, hey, that's not like a joke. Like those kinds of jokes aren't really what we find funny in this friend group, right? And that's not really okay to say without being like, whoa, that's not okay, right? Because in like scenario or like I don't know, in I've watched bystander intervention training videos where they're like acting out a scenario when someone makes a joke, and then another person's like, whoa, that's not okay. Nobody talks like that in friend groups most of the time, right? And as much as maybe we want to change that culture, and that can be a really helpful thing to kind of start introducing things like saying, hey, that's not okay, and being direct about those things, a lot of the time we won't feel comfortable doing that, right? So just asking them to repeat the joke or explain it. Good. Sana says maybe talking to them privately about it later, right? Maybe if it's a friend of a friend, right? Talking to the one that you know better about it and saying, hey, I noticed your friend, I've only hung out with them a few times, but they said this joke. Is there, like, is there any way that we could talk to them together, right? Something like that. Good, yes. And Lynn says, I've been in this situation at a party and just flat out told the person it wasn't appropriate. Good. So that direct intervention could actually be a viable strategy. Really nice. Good. Okay, what time is it? Okay, we're doing pretty well. Two more scenarios. This one, you're at the gym, so another stranger situation. Okay, while you're working out, you notice a man following a woman around the equipment and making lewd comments about her body. Okay, and about her outfit. She ignores him, but he persists. Right. So we're noticing some of the harm here. We're noticing persistence. But these are also strangers. We're noticing maybe a power dynamic with these gender roles. So yeah, same question. General thoughts and or intervention strategies here. There's someone maybe who has more authority in this space, right? Maybe there's a floor manager or a staff member that you can talk to. Good. So notifying the staff. Nice.
Yeah, I think like what you're saying, a dual approach of like distract and delegate, and then
Mm-hmm.
maybe helping with the third, being more direct with the staff member if you felt comfortable too, like just so that there's more than just one staff member having to deal with it.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, good. So I'm seeing that in the chat as well. Good. They may have seen this person before. Yeah. It's often a common thing at places like this. David says, approach the man and tell him he's a perv, then get ready to go hands on. Good. So this actually brings up a few different things, right? If you feel comfortable with that direct intervention, that could be an option. But something that I think the gender uh, situation and the gender roles introduce here, right, is maybe you're more comfortable approaching a man if you are a man, right?
Right.
Maybe if you're a woman or someone who might be perceived, I don't know, like me, like a tiny, like a skinny little gay dude, right, is probably going to have a lot less sway over someone like that than maybe my dad, who's really big and intimidating and has a beard, right? So like those factors are also considerations, right? We talked about this in a bar situation, right, where maybe there's a guy approaching a woman and trying to give her alcohol. And it's a lot different if a guy goes up and says, hey, what are you doing? Versus if a girl goes up. Or if a guy goes up to the woman and says, hey, are you okay? It could probably maybe be seen as another kind of advance, right? Rather than support. And so really taking account of those dynamics and saying, how is my identity coming into the picture here? Good. And then Danielle says, notify the staff, but also start a conversation with the woman to get her away from the situation. Really good. So I like that a lot. So kind of this dual pronged strategy saying, I'm going to go get the staff, but what's a distraction technique I can use? Or asking, hey, can you show me how to do this? Or can you spot me? Or something like that. And again, using the strategy of approaching the person being harmed first, unless, like David, we're very confident and able to and feel like we can approach the perpetrator in a safe way. Okay. Okay, for the sake of time, last situation. At work, you notice one of your colleagues from another department has been flirting with a woman in the office. Within earshot, your colleague starts confidently making some rather explicit sexual jokes in a flirty way towards the woman, who begins to look a little uncomfortable. One time, he comes up behind her and starts giving her a shoulder rub without asking, and you notice that she quickly swats his hands away. Okay. So I think it's pretty evident that there is some harm going on here, right? But there are a lot of reasons why we might not intervene, right? We don't know the person being harmed. Maybe we're friends with one of the colleague that is causing this harm or escalating the situation. Maybe there are a lot of workplace politics that we don't want to mess up a delicate balance. Okay. So with all those things in mind, what are some of the first strategies that come to mind as we're talking about intervening? Good. David says document, then approach the woman later. Absolutely. Good. I think documenting can be a good situation in this context, right? You're in a workplace, so there's probably, the likelihood that, there's going to be a full on sexual assault, right, in the next hour is probably pretty low. And so documenting can be pretty good, a good way to kind of subtly signal support. Danielle says, report it to my supervisor and or HR, reach out to the woman afterwards. Good. Yeah. And I want to spend some time. Oh, and Laura says, document what you saw in an email to HR or use an anonymous complaint option. Good. Good. So I like how you mentioned those office politics, right? If there is an anonymous reporting system, that could be an opportunity. Maybe if you feel like you should go through HR at your work, but you don't want to get involved with those politics, maybe making an anonymous report through the sexual violence helpline or through a state agency, right? And if it's a minor involved, right, all of us are mandatory reporters, so we have to report it to an outside agency anyway, right? So taking note of those options and saying maybe there's an external or a third party who's not beholden to these politics that I can sort of get involved. Let's see. Reaching and then finally with reaching out to the woman afterwards, I think this is actually really important. And this goes into our larger project of how do we change these consent cultures, right? Which was our presentation last time. And saying, really signaling to people who might have experienced harm that, hey, even if I don't exactly know what to do, I'm noticing these things, and I want to know that, I want you to know that I'm here to support you, right? Okay, so we are right on time. Any questions about scenarios or the strategies that we talked about? Obviously, it's one thing to go through an hour presentation and be like, here's what to do. And so that's why I really wanted us to start thinking about these power dynamics and what it looks like in real life, right? There's always going to be situations where we have all this information in our heads, but we still don't know how to intervene, right? So in those situations, I really want to encourage us to know that there are resources we can reach out to in the moment, like these hotlines, like our center, like maybe someone with more authority. And mostly, I just want us to know that there are more options than direct intervention. Danielle, thank you so much for that comment. I appreciate it. Good. So I know it's exactly 1 o'clock, but if you could please go back to that survey that hopefully you've kept open and complete that second page. You can do this after the call, whenever. It's really simple, just 3 questions. But this really helps us, and it ensures that we can keep doing this work. So we keep our funding, so that we can show that we're actually being effective in the community. So I'll put my email again, just like last time, in the chat. You can always ask any questions to me or to Sana. I don't want to volunteer Sana, but we are the community engagement team, so please do reach out. But yeah, I will shut up and see if there's any questions.
Oh, thank you so much for the information and even the opportunity to walk through scenarios, right? I think it's easy to say this is how you do it, but then when you find yourself in the moment, it can be overwhelming. Like you had asked, what emotions would that bring up? And oftentimes it can be anxiety, or you feel really nervous or just overwhelmed by the situation. And so I think it's really great to be able to sit and see yourself in those scenarios and role play in your head, or even with somebody just talking about it, right? So thank you. And I think it's also really important that, like what you had mentioned earlier in the presentation, is deciding that you're going to be that one person that decides to do something, whether, it's delay or document or direct, however you choose to do it. I think the most important thing is choosing to act, being an active bystander rather than just, falling into the bystander effect and saying, somebody else will deal with it, or,
Exactly.
if somebody else isn't doing it, then I must not need to do it too.
Yeah.
So I just think it's really important to identify the role and the power that we can play in these situations. And that's what makes all of the difference, right?
Yeah.
So.
Oh, thanks for saying that. I really like that way of putting it. This sort of thing is meant to empower us, right? To say, actually, we can do something about these things. Because I think most of us want to do something when we see harm, or we want the harm to end, right? And so, yeah, it really is just I'm the one that's going to step up first, and knowing that everyone else is probably thinking, what do I do? What's the right thing to do here? I want to help. they'll probably jump in, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that there's so many different options too, right? I think
Yeah.
oftentimes we think that it has to be this big act, it has to be direct, and that's the
Hmm.
only way to make an impact. And like you just busted that myth for us today, is that there's so many different options depending on the personality of yourself, also the situation that you find yourself in. So
Hmm.
there's no excuse not to act, I feel like. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
It doesn't look like there's any questions coming through, but
Yeah.
I will make sure that everyone that attended today has your information as well as the
Wonderful.
recording so that we can share with our coworkers and friends so that this information is widespread. So again, thank you so much for your time, Sam.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate your expertise and your willingness to talk to us today.
No, like I really appreciate being here, and thanks you all for participating and being willing to learn. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much. We hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. Check out our YouTube channel or our website for the recording. Other than that, thanks, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks, Sam. See ya. Thanks, Lara and Sana as well.